Imagine being castrated as a child, stripped of your manhood, and then forced to spend your life lurking in the shadows of palace bedchambers, watching the most intimate moments of royalty. What if I told you that some of history's most trusted servants were actually the empire's most dangerous spies, and their targets weren't enemy armies, but the queens they served? Tonight, behind closed doors, while passion burned and secrets were whispered, these silent watchers gathered intelligence that could topple kingdoms. Today we're uncovering the heartbreaking, unbelievable, and truly disturbing stories of the eunuchs who were forced to spy on their queen's most private moments. From the opulent palaces of Byzantium to the forbidden chambers of Imperial China, we'll explore the dark side of royal courts where trust was a luxury no one could afford. You won't believe the lengths these empires went to control their queens' bodies, hearts, and minds. By the time we reach number 1, you'll be stunned by the most shocking surveillance scandal in royal history. For over 2 millennia, eunuchs served as the bridge between the male-dominated political world and the secluded female quarters of royal palaces. Castrated to ensure they posed no physical threat to royal bloodlines, they became the ultimate insiders, trusted with secrets that could destroy dynasties. But what history books rarely reveal is how these seemingly loyal servants became unwilling participants in elaborate espionage networks, forced to betray the very women who relied on them for companionship and protection. Number 10. The Byzantine Whisper, NEWR, case starting off at number 10. We enter the glittering but treacherous world of 6th century Constantinople, where eunuch Narses served Empress Theodora. Unlike most eunuchs who were castrated as children, Narses volunteered for the procedure as an adulted decision that would haunt him for decades. Theodora, former actress who married Emperor Justinian, is constantly suspected of maintaining relationships with her former theatrical colleagues. Imperial court buzzed with rumors about midnight visitors and secret correspondence. Narses, as the chief eunuch of the palace, had unprecedented access to Theodora's private quarters. What makes this case particularly disturbing is that Narses genuinely cared for Theodora. He saw her intelligence, her political acumen, her genuine love for the empire. Yet he was systematically reporting her every conversation, every visitor, every moment of solitude to a network of court officials who desperately wanted to find evidence of infidelity. Historical records show that Narses kept detailed logs of Theodora's daily activities, including intimate details about her bathing habits, correspondence, and the time she spent with various courtiers. The psychological torture was immense. Narses was watching a woman he respected being treated like a criminal in her own home, all while he participated in her surveillance. When Theodora discovered his betrayal through intercepted messages, she didn't execute him. She kept him close, turning him into a double agent who fed false information back to his handlers. The emotional manipulation created a web of deception that lasted until her death. But this was just the beginning of how far empires would go to control their queens. Number 9. The Ottoman listening POSDSAT. Number 9. We traveled to 16th century Istanbul, where the Ottoman Empire perfected the art of intimate surveillance through eunuch Gazanfer Akar, who served in the harem of Sultan Murad III. The Ottoman harem housed hundreds of women, but none were watched more closely than the Sultan's favorites, who might become mothers to future heirs. Gazanfer, a Circassian boy castrated at age 12, rose to become the Kizlar Akas, the chief black eunuch who controlled all access to the imperial women. What's truly chilling is how the Ottomans turned the harem's architecture into a surveillance system. Hidden panels behind silk tapestries, false walls with listening chambers, and even specially designed furniture with secret compartments allowed to monitor conversations without being detected. Gazanfer supervised a network of junior eunuchs who would rotate through these hidden posts, creating 24-hour surveillance of the Sultan's most intimate relationships. But the most disturbing element was the pillow reports. Detailed accounts of intimate conversations between the Sultan and his concubines, recorded immediately after each encounter. These reports included not just political discussions, but emotional confessions, fears, dreams, and pillow talk that revealed the women's true feelings about court politics and rival wives. Gazanfer's own writings, discovered in the Ottoman archives, reveal his growing disgust with the system, wrote, feeling like a ghost haunting the happiness of others, forced to violate the privacy of women who trusted him as their protector. Several concubines committed suicide when they realized the extent of the surveillance, unable to bear the knowledge that even their most private moments were being documented and analyzed. The psychological damage extended beyond the women eunuchs. Like Gazanfer, lived in constant fear of being discovered by the Sultan, knowing that revealing the surveillance network would mean death by impalement. Number 8. The Ming Dynasty's shadow, WATCHERs, coming in at number 8. We enter the forbidden city of 15th century China, where eunuch Wangzun created the most sophisticated royal surveillance network in history under the Jiangtong Emperor. The Chinese imperial system elevated eunuchs to positions of tremendous power. But with that power came an obligation to monitor the empress and imperial concubines for any sign of political conspiracy or romantic entanglement outside the imperial bed. Wangzun, who had been castrated as punishment for his father's crimes, understood that his survival depended on providing the emperor with intelligence about his wives' loyalties. What makes the Chinese system particularly horrifying is its technological sophistication. The Forbidden City was designed with a network of secret passages that allowed eunuchs to move unseen throughout the women's quarters. But Wangzun went further, creating an elaborate system of mirrors and bronze plates that could reflect and amplify sound, allowing surveillance from considerable distances. The most disturbing innovation was the bamboo telegraph, a network of hollow bamboo tubes built into the palace walls that could carry whispered conversations from the imperial bedchambers, 2 listening posts throughout the complex. Eunuchs would take shifts, listening to these tubes, transcribing intimate conversations between the emperor and his wives. But Wang Zhen's greatest violation was the creation of detailed, sexual profiles of each imperial woman. These documents, written in coded language, analyzed each woman's physical responses, emotional vulnerabilities, and political opinions expressed during intimate moments. The goal was to identify which women might be manipulating the emperor or planning to elevate their sons to positions of power. The psychological warfare was devastating. Imperial women lived in constant paranoia, never knowing when their private thoughts might be used against them. Several empresses and concubines developed severe mental health issues, including what we would now recognize as anxiety disorders and depression. Some resorted to communicating only through elaborate hand signals or written notes that they would immediately burn. Wangzun himself became addicted to opium, unable to cope with the emotional weight of his role as the destroyer of trust and intimacy in the imperial household. Number 7. The Fatimid Caliphate's trust. Number 7. We examine one of history's most heartbreaking cases of forced espionage, Eunuch Jawhar. Al-Sakili's surveillance of Caliph al-Mu'i's beloved wife Saida al-Mulk in 10th century. Cairo Jawhar had been captured as a child during raids in Sicily, castrated, and raised in the Fatimid court where he developed genuine affection for the royal family. Saida al-Mulk treated him as a trusted friend and confidant, sharing her fears about court politics and her concerns for her children's safety. What she didn't know was that the caliph's vizier had threatened Jawhar's remaining family members unless he provided detailed reports of the caliph's wife's activities and conversations. The Fatimid system was particularly cruel because it exploited the genuine emotional bonds between eunuchs and the royal women they served. Unlike other courts where surveillance was openly acknowledged, the Fatimids relied on betraying established trust. Saida al-Mulk would confide in Jawhar about her worries that certain courtiers were plotting against her husband, not knowing that Jawhar was forced to report these very conversations to those same plotters. What makes this case especially disturbing is the documentation of Jawhar's internal struggle. His personal journal, discovered in the 20th century, reveals a man Torn between loyalty to a woman who had shown him kindness and terror for his family's safety, he wrote detailed descriptions of having to maintain a caring demeanor. While mentally cataloging every word for his evening reports, the surveillance included monitoring Saida al-Mulk's correspondence with her family, her private religious practices, and her interactions with her children. Johar was forced to report on her parenting methods, her concerns about succession, and even her medical complaints and treatments. The vizier used this information to gradually isolate her from allies and influence the caliph's perception of his wife's loyalty. The betrayal ultimately destroyed both women. When Saida al-Mulk discovered the surveillance network through a loyal servant, she confronted Johar directly. His journal describes her reaction. She wept not for herself, but for what they had made me become. Her pity was worse than her anger. She withdrew completely from court life, speaking to no one except through written commands, and died within 2 years, many historians believe from heartbreak and stress. Johor requested exile immediately. After her death, unable to continue living in the palace, where he had destroyed the only genuine relationship in his life. Number 6. The Safavid Empire's intimate. We uncover the shocking story of eunuch Mirza Safi and his forced surveillance of Shah Abbas, the first's wife, Queen Gulshan, in 17th century Isfahan. The Safavid court operated under the assumption that royal wives were potential security threats, capable of passing state secrets to their birth families or foreign agents. Mirza Safi, who had been purchased as a castrated slave from Ottoman territories, was specifically trained in what the Safavids called intimate intelligence, the art of gathering political information through emotional manipulation and sexual surveillance. What makes this case particularly disturbing is how systematically Mirza Safi was trained to exploit Queen Gulshan's emotional needs. The queen, isolated from her birth family and struggling with multiple miscarriages, desperately needed emotional support. Mirza Safi was instructed to become her closest confidant, share her deepest fears and political observations. The surveillance extended to every aspect of the queen's private life. Mirza Safi documented her menstrual cycles, her emotional states, her dreams and nightmares, and her private conversations with midwives and physicians. This information was used to predict her psychological vulnerabilities and manipulate her emotional state to extract more sensitive information. But the most horrifying aspect was the pleasure mapping. Detailed documentation of the queen's intimate responses during her encounters with the Shah. Mirza Safi was forced to position himself in hidden alcoves during royal intimate moments, recording not just conversations but physical responses that could be analyzed for signs of deception or manipulation. The psychological torture extended to manufactured crises. When the intelligence gathered wasn't deemed sufficient, Mirza Safi was ordered to create emotional situations that would prompt the queen to reveal more about her true loyalties. He would share false rumors about threats to her family, forcing her to reveal her communication networks and political alliances. Queen Gulshan eventually discovered the surveillance when she found Mirza Safi's detailed reports hidden in his quarters. Rather than expose him immediately, she began feeding him false information, creating an elaborate counterintelligence operation that lasted for months. When she finally revealed her knowledge, she had already gathered enough evidence to execute. Several court officials involved in the surveillance network. Mirza Safi was publicly castrated again, a symbolic punishment that involved burning his existing scars before being exiled to the desert, where he died alone and abandoned by all sides. Number 5. The Mughal Empire's broken band. SAT number 5. We witness one of history's most tragic betrayals. Eunuch Hasan Ali Khan's surveillance of Empress Mumtaz Mahal, the beloved wife of Shah Jahan, in 17th century Agra. Hasan Ali had served the imperial family since childhood, becoming not just a servant but a trusted friend to Mumtaz. She relied on him for emotional support during her numerous pregnancies and complicated court politics. What she never suspected was that Shah Jahan's paranoia about potential threats to the dynasty had led him to order surveillance of his own wife, the woman for whom he would later build the Taj Mahal. The Mughal Surveillance system was particularly insidious because it operated under the guise of protection. Hazan Ali was told that monitoring the empress was necessary for her safety. To identify potential threats from rival wives, ambitious courtiers, or foreign agents, but the reality was far more sinister. The surveillance was designed to ensure that Mumtaz's legendary influence over Shah Jahan wasn't being exploited by outside forces. Hazan Ali was forced to document every conversation between Mumtaz and her family members, her interactions with religious scholars, and her private discussions about court politics. The surveillance included monitoring her correspondence, her charitable activities, and her influence on political appointments. Most disturbingly, he had to report on her private conversations about her children's education and future roles. In the empire, what makes this case heartbreaking is that Mumtaz genuinely trusted Hazan Ali with her life. During her dangerous pregnancies, she would confide her fears about dying in childbirth and her concerns for her children's welfare. She shared her dreams of architectural projects and her ideas for social reforms. All of these intimate conversations were meticulously recorded and analyzed for potential security threats. The surveillance network included other eunuchs who would corroborate Hazan Ali's reports, creating a comprehensive intelligence picture of the empress's every move. The psychological pressure on Hazan Ali was immense. He was destroying the trust of a woman who had shown him genuine affection while serving a Shah who increasingly viewed everyone, including his beloved wife, as a potential threat. The tragedy deepened when Mumtaz died during childbirth of their 14th child. Hazan Ali's final reports detail her last conversations, including her fears that she was being watched and her sadness that she couldn't trust anyone completely. Her death left Hazan Ali devastated by guilt, knowing that her final months had been shadowed by the paranoia he had helped create. Shah Jahan's grief over losing Mumtaz led him to discover the surveillance network he had authorized. In his anguish, he ordered the execution of all eunuchs involved in spying on his wife, including Hazan Ali, who was killed just months before construction began on the Taj Mahal, the monument to the very woman he had been forced to betray. Number 4. The Roman Empire's ultimate. We confront one of the most shocking surveillance cases in ancient history, the systematic spying on Empress Julia Domna, wife of Emperor Septimius Severus, orchestrated by the Praetorian Guard using castrated slaves in 3rd century. Julia Domna was a brilliant Syrian princess who became one of Rome's most influential empresses. But her foreign origins and philosophical interests made the Roman elite suspicious of her loyalties. The Praetorian Guard, seeking to maintain their influence over imperial policy, created an elaborate surveillance network using eunuchs who had been castrated as punishment for various crimes. What makes this case particularly horrifying is the level of physical and psychological violation involved. The surveillance wasn't limited to conversations and correspondence. It included intimate physical examinations designed to verify the empress's fidelity and monitor her health for signs of pregnancy or disease that might affect succession planning. The lead eunuch, Marcus Aurelius Clinder, who had chosen a Roman name to hide his castrated status, was forced to conduct weekly medical examinations of the empress under the pretense of ensuring her health. These examinations were actually intelligence-gathering sessions where he documented intimate details about her body, her emotional state, and any physical evidence of romantic encounters. But the most disturbing element was the loyalty testing, elaborate, psychological manipulations designed to test Julia Domna's allegiance to Rome versus her Syrian heritage. Clinder would present her with fabricated scenarios, false information about threats to her family, staged crises to observe her reactions and determine where her true loyalties lay. The surveillance network included monitoring her correspondence with philosophers, her private religious practices. She followed Syrian deities alongside Roman gods, and her influence on her sons Caracalla and Geta. Every philosophical discussion, every religious ritual, every maternal conversation was documented, analyzed for signs of foreign influence or political conspiracy. Julia Domna eventually discovered the surveillance through a loyal slave who revealed the network's existence. and brutal Shay used her influence to convince Septimius Severus that the Praetorian Guard was plotting against the imperial family. The resulting purge eliminated most of the surveillance network, but not before the psychological damage had been done. Clender's fate was particularly gruesome. Julia Domna ordered him to be castrated again in public, then forced to endure the same medical examinations he had conducted on her, performed by executioners rather than physicians. He was kept alive for months, subjected to daily humiliations that mirrored his violations of her privacy. Before finally being executed, the trauma of the surveillance contributed to Julia Domna's later mental instability and her decision to commit suicide rather than face capture after her son Caracallus's assassination. She could never again trust that her privacy was secure. Number 3. The Abbasid Caliphate's institutional BTRA. Latin number 3. We uncover the systematic destruction of trust in the Abbasid court, where Eunuch Alfath ibn Khakan was forced to spy on Caliph al-Mutawakkil's wife, Kaaba, in Zilth entry. Baghdad Alfath had been captured as a child from the Caucasus, castrated, and raised in the Abbasid court, where he developed exceptional intelligence and administrative skills. He became not just a servant, but an intellectual companion to Kaaba, who was renowned for her poetry and political acumen. What makes this case devastating is that their relationship was genuinely based on mutual respect and shared interests. In literature and philosophy, the Abbasid surveillance system was institutionalized in ways that made resistance almost impossible. Alfath wasn't just reporting to court officials, he was part of a formal intelligence bureaucracy with written protocols, standardized forms, and systematic methods for gathering and analyzing information about royal women. The surveillance included monitoring Kabka's intellectual activities, her correspondence with poets and scholars, and her influence on the caliph's policies. But what makes this case particularly disturbing is the intellectual seduction component. Ath was instructed to engage Kaaba in deep philosophical and political discussions, specifically to extract her views on sensitive topics. The bureaucratization of surveillance meant that Alfath had to submit weekly written reports using standardized categories: political opinions, religious observances, social contacts, emotional state, and physical condition. Each category had subcategories and required specific types of evidence and documentation. But the most horrifying aspect was the emotional manipulation protocol. Alfath was given training in psychological techniques designed to make Kaaba more emotionally dependent on him and therefore more likely to share sensitive information. He was taught to create artificial crises that would prompt emotional confessions to provide comfort that would lead to trust, and to use their intellectual bond to extract political intelligence. The psychological toll on Alfath was documented in private letters he wrote to his brother, which were later intercepted by the same surveillance network. He described feeling like a parasite feeding on kindness, and expressed growing horror at how effectively he was manipulating a woman he genuinely admired. The discovery of the surveillance came through the most tragic possible means. Kaaba found Alfa's own reports while helping him organize documents during an illness. She read detailed analyses of her own emotions, her intellectual development, her political views, all written by the man she had considered her closest friend. Her confrontation with Alfath was witnessed by several palace servants and later recorded by historians. She didn't express anger or hurt. Instead, she methodically went through each report, correcting factual errors and pointing out misinterpretations of her motivations. Her clinical approach to the betrayal was more devastating than any emotional outburst could have been. Kaaba's response was to withdraw completely from intellectual life, burning her poetry, ending her correspondence with scholars, and refusing to engage in any political discussions. She effectively created her own isolation to ensure that no one could ever again use her thoughts and feelings against her or her family. Alfath requested transfer to military service, preferring the honesty of warfare to the corruption of surveillance. He died in battle against Byzantine forces. Many historians believe deliberately seeking death as an escape from the guilt of his betrayal. Number 2. The Tang Dynasty's perfect ECRV Selenci Ayat. Number 2. we encounter the most technically sophisticated surveillance operation in ancient history, Eunuch Li Fuguo's comprehensive monitoring of Empress Wu Zishan during her rise to power. In 7th century China, Li Fuguo had been castrated as a child and trained from birth to serve in the imperial women's quarters. By the time he was assigned to monitor Wu Zishan, then concubine Wu, he had been conditioned to view surveillance as his primary duty and loyalty to the throne as his highest virtue. What makes this case exceptional is that he was spying on arguably the most intelligent and politically sophisticated woman in Chinese history. The Thames surveillance system represented the pinnacle of pre-modern intelligence gathering. Li Fuguo supervised a network of junior eunuchs, palace maids, and even trained birds that could carry messages between hidden observation posts throughout the Forbidden City. The system included mirrors positioned to observe activities in private chambers, acoustic engineering that amplified conversations, and even chemical analysis of discarded papers to reveal invisible writing. But what makes this case truly disturbing is the intellectual nature of the surveillance. Wu Zishan was not just monitored for political conspiracy. Every aspect of her extraordinary mind was documented and analyzed. Li Fuguo recorded her reading habits, her philosophical discussions, her poetry, her strategic thinking, and her innovations in court administration. The surveillance included intellectual entrapment. Li Fuguo would present Wu Zishan with carefully crafted hypothetical scenarios designed to reveal her political ambitions and strategic thinking. He would engage her in discussions about governance, military strategy, and philosophical problems, all while mentally cataloging her responses for detailed reports. The most shocking element was the documentation of Wu Zishan's emotional evolution. From concubine to empress, Li Fuguo's reports track her growing confidence, her developing political skills, and her increasing willingness to challenge traditional gender roles. These psychological profiles were used by court officials to predict and counter her political moves. But Li Fuguo made a crucial error. He underestimated Wu Zishan's intelligence. She gradually became aware of the surveillance through careful observation and strategic testing. Instead of confronting the system directly, she began using it to her advantage, feeding Li Fuguo carefully crafted information designed to mislead her opponents while gathering intelligence about the surveillance network itself. The tables completely turned when Wu Zishan became empress and gained control of the palace administration. She retained Li Fuguo, but forced him to redirect the surveillance network toward her political enemies. Li Fuguo found himself in the impossible position of using the same techniques he'd used against her to spy on the very officials who had originally commanded his loyalty. Zishan's ultimate revenge was psychological. She never directly acknowledged her knowledge of Li Fuguo's surveillance, but she gradually made it clear that she had always known about his activities. She would casually reference details from his old reports about her, quote his exact phrases back to him, and make subtle references to his surveillance techniques. Li Fuguo lived the rest of his life in constant uncertainty about how much Wu Zishan knew and what she might do with that knowledge. He became increasingly paranoid, unable to trust anyone, and unable to be certain whether his own activities were being monitored. Wu Zishan had turned the psychological torture of surveillance back on its original perpetrator. Number 1. The Byzantine Empire's ultimate betrayal. Number 1. Confront the most heartbreaking and psychologically devastating case of forced surveillance in human history. Eunuch John Constantinople surveillance of Empress Irene of Athens. The woman who loved him like a son in 8th century Constantinople. John had been castrated at age 10, and taken from his family to serve in the Imperial palace. Empress Irene, who had become sole ruler after her husband's death, took personal responsibility for John's education and emotional development. She treated him not as a servant, but as the child she could never safely have in the dangerous world of Byzantine politics. For 15 years their relationship was that of mother and son. She guided his intellectual development, confided in him about the challenges of female rule, and relied on him for emotional support in a court filled with ambitious men who resented her power. What makes this case the ultimate betrayal is that John genuinely loved Irene, had given him the only parental affection he had ever known. But the Patriarch of Constantinople and a coalition of generals had threatened to expose John's family's secret survival. They had not been killed as reported, unless he provided detailed intelligence about Irene's vulnerabilities, process, and her private fears about maintaining power as a woman. The surveillance went beyond politics into the deepest levels of emotional intimacy. John was forced to document Irene's private prayers, her nightmares about losing power, her fears for the empire's future, and her personal struggles with the loneliness of absolute authority. Recorded her maternal affection toward him, her trust in his loyalty, and her private admissions of vulnerability, all while knowing this information would be used to destroy her. The psychological torture was amplified by the genuine nature of their relationship. Irene would seek John's comfort when she was troubled, ask his advice on difficult decisions, and share her hopes for the empire's future. She treated him as her heir in all but name, planning to grant him unprecedented authority and ensure his security for life. Every act of kindness from her increased his guilt while making his betrayal more comprehensive. But the most devastating element was the succession manipulation. John was forced to gradually influence Irene's thinking about potential heirs and successors, subtly steering her toward decisions that would benefit the conspiracy against her. He had to use her love and trust to manipulate her into weakening her own position. The discovery came in the most brutal possible way. Irene found John's reports while he was ill with fever and calling out in delirium about his guilt and his family's danger. She read 15 years of detailed surveillance documenting not just her political activities, but her most private emotional moments, her expressions of love for him, and his systematic analysis of her psychological vulnerabilities. Her reaction was not anger, but complete emotional collapse. According to contemporary accounts, she sat with the reports for an entire day, reading every document while John lay unconscious nearby. When he recovered, she confronted him not with accusations, but with questions. Did you ever love me, even? Slightly. Was any moment between us real? The aftermath destroyed both of them. Irene couldn't execute John because she still loved him despite his betrayal, but she couldn't trust him either. She kept him close but treated him with a coldness that was more painful than any punishment. John lived in constant awareness of the love he had destroyed, watching Irene withdraw emotionally from everyone around her. The political consequences were exactly what the conspirators had planned. Irene's emotional devastation affected her decision-making, leading to the mistakes that eventually cost her the throne. But the psychological consequences lasted long after the political ones. John survived Irene's fall from power, but never recovered from the guilt of destroying the only loving relationship in his life. He spent his final years in a monastery, writing detailed confessions about the surveillance system and its psychological effects on both the watchers and the watched. His writings, discovered centuries later, provide the most complete account we have of how institutional surveillance destroys the human capacity for trust and love. John's final entry, his confession reads, "I traded a mother's love for the survival of people I never saw again. I became an expert in human hearts only to break the one that sheltered mine." Conclusion. From the glittering palaces of Constantinople to the forbidden chambers of Imperial China, from the desert courts of Baghdad to the mountain fortresses of Isfahan, the pursuit of absolute power transformed love into surveillance and trust into betrayal. These eunuchs, stripped of their manhood, isolated from natural families, and forced to choose between survival and conscience, became the unwilling architects of systems that destroyed the very human connections they desperately craved. Their stories remind us that surveillance is never just about gathering information. It's about the systematic destruction of intimacy, trust, and genuine human connection. The queens they watched lived in golden cages, never knowing which smile was genuine and which was part of an elaborate performance. The eunuchs themselves became prisoners of their own betrayals, unable to form real relationships because they had learned too well how love could be weaponized. Perhaps most chilling of all, these systems worked exactly as intended. The surveillance didn't just gather intelligence, it isolated the rulers. eliminated their capacity for trust, and made them dependent on the very people who were destroying their emotional lives. The eunuchs who were forced to spy on the queens. Lovers ultimately became the greatest threat to royal happiness that these empires ever produced. In our modern world of digital surveillance and institutional monitoring, these ancient stories serve as a warning about what we sacrifice when we choose security over privacy, control over trust, and power over love. The bones of these long-dead empires remind us that no dynasty, no matter how powerful, can survive the systematic destruction of human connection. The next time someone tells you that surveillance is just about safety, remember the eunuchs who were forced to spy on the queen's lovers and ask yourself what price you're willing to pay for that safety.